All right, hi. We're back after a very long hiatus. We got this as a special request. You know who you are. So we're gonna make sourdough bread today, and I'm gonna show you the 4 different steps that we have when we're making sourdough. The first is I'm going to talk about a starter a little bit. So a starter is really cool. It is a mixture of water and flour, and you leave it open, and there's yeast in the air, and this natural yeast is what we use for sourdough bread instead of using like baker's yeast. And this is what gives sourdough like the really tangy flavor, because the starter takes about 7 days to make, and then as you use it, like I've had this now for about 6 weeks, you have to feed it. It's pretty cool. It's like a symbiotic culture of yeast and bacteria. So you're feeding it. You have to keep it at certain temperatures. You can store it in the refrigerator for about a week until you have to pull it back out, let it come up to room temperature, feed it again. So it's a pretty cool thing to keep alive. And for my students, it's kind of like the kombucha that we brewed right before this craziness happened. There's a culture that has to stay alive, and you have to do certain things with it or it messes it up. You have to keep it away from sunlight and all this crazy stuff. So anyway, got that from a friend, but I've been feeding it and keeping it alive for like a good 6 weeks. So the first thing we're gonna do is mix up our dough. You have to use a scale, a digital scale, when you're baking at any kind of high level, because you have to be really exact. So I'm using, you can actually see the recipe up in the corner. Just kidding, I don't know how to do it. I'm using 300 grams of flour. I'm using 6 grams of salt. There's actually like a baker's ratio of making sourdough, and it's like 3% salt, 15% starter, and then 82% flour. I've been making sourdough with whole wheat flour and white flour.
Sourdough or flour dough?
Sourdough.
Okay, just checking.
I've been making sourdough with whole wheat flour and white flour, but I recently switched to just white flour because it just tastes more delicious, and I don't care about the extra fiber. So I'm using, oh, and also you have to use fine salt, because if you use like kosher salt or something, the flakes are too big. It will not mix as uniformly, and you'll get like salty bites. So little pieces of salt will mix more evenly, and that's why I whisked it. Then you use 100 grams of starter, which came from those jars I just showed you, 230 grams of water, and take a look in here. It looks gross. For those of you who make like pizza dough or something like that, it kind of looks like right when your instant yeast is ready to be mixed. So it's totally alive, and you just have to blend it together in the water so that it mixes uniformly. The recipe I followed was some guy in New York City who has like a sick bakery, and he like sells his bread to all the fancy restaurants in New York City, and he mixed it with his fingers, which I'm not opposed to doing, but I didn't feel like I was able to mix it as uniformly. You're supposed to mix it without, as quickly as you can, because you don't want to mess up the way the yeast activates. So it just kind of looks like a shaggy mess, and as long as you've incorporated, I'm kind of scraping the edges of the bowl so that I get all of the flour, water, and starter mixture ready to go. So it kind of looks like this, and this is going to sit with a kitchen towel draped over it for about 30 minutes. Next, we have a dough that's been sitting for 30 minutes. We are going to turn this dough, and we're going to fold this dough, and basically what we're doing there is we're stretching the glutens, and which are a bread protein, and you do that so you get a chewier bread. You don't want something flaky like a pie crust. So with a chewy bread, are going to have to turn it, and that's why people talk about kneading the dough. So this is a handy little pastry scraper. One of the challenging parts about making sourdough is it's a very wet dough, and that's part of the reason it develops such a beautiful crust, because it steams inside, and I'll talk about that a little later. So flour it lightly. You don't want to get too much flour though, because the more flour you incorporate, the further you get away from like a really good sourdough loaf. So can you come in a little closer, please?
Mm-hmm.
So basically what you're going to do is fold it in half a bunch of times. So you see there, kind of folded it. I'm going to fold it again. I'm going to switch, fold, and then fold. And then you kind of scrunch the sides around and like fold them under. Hands are getting a little sticky, so a little bit more flour. So it looks like a little lump. So that is ready to also be covered with a kitchen towel. And sit for 30 minutes. And here we have a dough that I've let the dough cure for 30 minutes. I turned it maybe 4 times every 30 minutes. Then I let it, more than 30 minutes, probably every 45 to an hour. I found that this really fast method didn't work quite as well for me as it did for the guy from the video that I first looked at. So I use a little bit more time. After the dough is ready to go, right before you put it into the oven, take a very sharp serrated knife and you give it like a little cut through the center. And this is something that you'll see with a finished loaf. So we have an oven at 475 degrees.
Hi, Sammy.
I'm going to cook the bread in a cast iron, enameled cast iron pot. It's looking a little rough now since I've made so many loaves. It's on parchment paper, and it is covered in, and the bottom of it is some wheat germ. Whoop, excuse me, I forgot this. And we also want the lid on. And the bottom is wheat germ so it doesn't stick, and that will cook. Yeah, here's some wheat germ. This is like what's in
Show the
wheat bran
container.
Yeah. This is like what's in wheat bran, and after it cooks with the lid on, the steam produces the crispy crust on the bread, and you remove the lid, and then here's a finished loaf. It is still warm. After 30 minutes, cook it for another about 20 minutes, and you should hear the nice crumbling of the crust. Cut into it, and we have the nice air pockets in there to see that it rose well, and that is a sourdough loaf. Have a good night.